Conservative ministers now say that reform of the NHS was their biggest political mistake. They're widely opposed, widely derided and little understood. So what were they thinking? Well, to start, they were motivated by one very big fact. Society is ageing, demand for care is rising, and so are treatment costs. That's why politicians keep chiselling away at the NHS. They're trying to keep its costs down.
I think the remarkable thing about the NHS is that if you think about it, in the 4 decades after it was created in 1948, there was barely any change. Nothing changed, everything stayed the same. And in the 3 decades since, it's been a process of continual change.
The opposition warned of government plans to privatise the health service. Ministers said that was a lie.
For all of the political storms around reform of the English NHS since the late 1980s, the running of the health service has been dominated by one big idea. With a few exceptions, pretty much everything has been a footnote to Ken Clarke.
Well, Margaret had decided she wanted to reform the health service, but she had a quite different idea of what she meant, half thought out. She wanted to go to the American system. She wanted to have compulsory insurance, giving tax relief, and then have a fallback system which gave it free to people who couldn't afford it. Disastrous. I mean, the American system is awful and doesn't cover effectively about 40% of the population. And I had to sell her in a series of really vigorous meetings the idea of this purchaser-provider divide and a proper organisation that gave patients a choice of source of treatment.
The aim of the purchaser-provider split is to increase the amount of choice and competition inside the NHS. The big idea is that if you go to see your doctor and you need treatment, your GP will help you choose a hospital that best meets your needs. And hospitals are only paid for the treatment they actually deliver. So good hospitals who can attract patients easily will be able to get more money and grow. And bad hospitals who struggle to attract patients will shrink or even shut. So where does the name come from? Well, under this system, the NHS is divided in two. On one hand, you've got the GPs, the people with money to buy services. They're the purchasers. On the other hand, you've got the hospitals competing for their business. They're the providers. The purchaser-provider split is controversial because it made the NHS open to private providers. After all, you can't really have competition if you don't have a choice of suppliers.
I've personally never been a fan of monopolies in any walk of life. They're not usually characterised either by operational efficiency or by customer responsiveness. And that's why certainly when I was Health Secretary, I introduced what you call a managed market into healthcare, which not only brought additional capacity into the market for patients, so you could do more elective surgery, get waiting times down and so on. But it also put the NHS hospitals on the mettle. And all the evidence seems to suggest if you do it in the right way, competition within the National Health Service, providing it's managed strategically, can be a really good thing, both for patients and for taxpayers.
Now, private provision still isn't the norm. Although it grew steadily under recent governments, it's still only about 6% of English health spending.
I call the Secretary of State for Health, Mr. Andrew Lansley.
The coalition reforms, Andrew Lansley's Health and Social Care Act, sought to build on those legacies. First, by making doctors more powerful on the purchasing side of the NHS. They wanted GPs to have more say over their managers. Second, Mr. Lansley wanted to give doctors incentives to innovate and save money.
If you're a doctor, a GP in the mid-2000s and you want to change a particular service and generate savings from those changes and then plough them into another area of care, and that's one of your motivations for changing the service, if you're not going to be as inclined to do that, as motivated to do that, if a health service manager, maybe at the regional level or the national level, is just going to take those savings from you and use it to prop up another area of the health service.
But these plans proved enormously controversial. Even the bill's supporters wonder whether the same effects could have been achieved with less institutional change. And some people oppose it on principle.
Well, I remember reading Lansley's white paper, and I can remember it now, a sentence that leapt off the page and it remains quite vivid to me, and it was this. It said, in the future, the headquarters of the NHS will be in every consulting room in the land. And I just thought, what a recipe for utter chaos.
It's also been suggested that even David Cameron didn't really know what his health secretary was proposing.
During the whole passage of the reforms, during the passage of the Health and Social Care Bill, we encountered just noises off from other parts of government. And the parts of government which were concerned changed over time. But each time new concerns were raised, we sat down with other bits of government and we addressed them. And we won the arguments on every occasion inside government. And we did that in July 2010, in December 2010, in June 2011, and again at the beginning of 2012.
We can get an idea of how well the reforms are going from a measure called PROMs, the Patient-Reported Outcome Measures. Before patients have a major operation, they're asked to fill in a form saying how well they are. Then afterwards, we get them to fill it in again so we can see the change. Now, using PROMs, we can identify which providers are good and which aren't. And for the first year of the reforms, we can monitor whether the number of, say, hip replacements at bad providers is falling, and conversely, whether the number of procedures being referred to good ones is rising. Over the first year of the reforms, the share of hip operations at the weakest providers stayed at just over 10% from the first to the fourth quarter of the year. But there was a tiny rise over that time in the number at the very good providers, from 10.5% to just over 11%. Now that's not a significant move, but this is the stuff to watch out for evidence on how the reforms are going. Whatever the evidence says, however, market-based health reform will always be controversial. First, real markets need new entrants, and that usually means private providers. Do you think there's a role for the private sector in health delivery?
Yes, but a limited role and a supporting role, not a replacement role. I believe in the public NHS and what it represents. I think that is what is precious about it, this system that doesn't mix up the views of shareholders with patient care. It's a system that puts people before profits, and that for me is what Danny Boyle was celebrating at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games.
And real markets require market exit. That means shutting down hospitals.
I closed more hospitals than most people have had hot dinners. But even when I was closing Victorian workhouses, which were labelled geriatric hospitals, we no longer needed, and maternity units which were dangerous for people to deliver children in. I always got a vast public petition on the local MP going on at me about the terrible things we were doing.
Labour wants less NHS business to go to private providers. They want to modify what GPs do and how commissioning works. They want to integrate social care into the system. But they still want independent purchases. Even their plans are another variation on Ken Clarke's big idea.